Well, we're in Luke chapter 22. We are kind of going quickly through the entire book to get the big story up through Easter, the resurrection story, and then after that we're going to go back and pick up some of the other things that have been talked about in Luke. So if there's some passages in the Gospel of Luke that are your favorite and you feel like we've skipped past them, don't worry, we might come back to them afterwards. But we're looking at a critical story in Luke 22, and it's about the establishment of the Lord's Supper, which of course is one of the important kind of traditions for all churches. I don't want to use the word ritual. It's kind of a ritual. Maybe for some people it's a ritual, and I don't like things to just be a ritual, but it's an important thing that Christians have done for 2,000 years as a way of reminding ourselves of who Jesus is and what he came to do and how we can involve ourselves in that. So we're going to look at that story and especially try to think about what it is that Luke wants to communicate to us through the way that he tells the story. Each of the Gospels have some little bits of the story. The way Luke tells it's a little bit different than Matthew and Mark, and I think he's doing that on purpose because he's got something in particular he wants us to understand. He wants us to look at that in a particular way. A couple weeks ago, we were talking about this idea of you are who you eat with. So I kind of, modified or edited the original one, you are what you eat, to suggest you are who you eat with. It was certainly true a couple thousand years ago, and it's still true in many cultures. And in many ways, even in our cultures here in Latvia or wherever we're from, who we choose to eat with or don't choose to eat with, who we invite to the table or feel free to sit with at a table, sometimes communicates a lot. And like I said a few weeks ago, in the culture of Jesus, that was very important. Who you ate with established your identity and your boundaries. So you would communicate something about yourself by who you would eat with and who you would not eat with. And so we're thinking about that again because once again, we're thinking about people being gathered around a table. And so we're going to talk about having a place at the table and what it means to have a place at the table and who has a place at the table and whose table it is and how that table operates and what it communicates. This is a famous picture. Da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper. This has been used a lot in the last year during COVID times because lots of people have done all sorts of fun things with this, like putting masks on all the characters, or just removing all the disciples and Jesus is alone at the table, because he's in lockdown too. And so there's been lots of kind of photoshopping with this particular image that Da Vinci painted. One of my favorite ones isn't really a COVID one, but it's someone developed dialogue with Jesus and the disciples, and it starts off with, Jesus. It's like they're at a restaurant, and Jesus tells the disciples, okay, each of you have to pay for your own meal. And so the rest of it is all the different things that the disciples are saying. It's very sarcastic. I think it's pretty funny. It might not be your kind of humor. But, you've seen this picture of the Last Supper. Of course, that image of Jesus telling people that, you have to pay for your own meal. I'm buying my meal, you buy your own meal. Of course, that's very counter to actually the first Last Supper. And by the way, this image of the Last Supper is very much a Renaissance painting, and you can see the perspective and the lines, and it's all arranged very precisely, but that is not how anyone sat at a table in Jesus' time, and this is not what the original Last Supper would have looked like. This image is probably closer to what it would have been, where you have a low table and people are not seated around it, more reclining around it. You have the word people reclined around the table, maybe pillows or something on the floor, and they're maybe leaning on an elbow, and in one hand they're using to eat, and so forth. So it would have looked much more like this, with them around the table, and, in some ways, Jesus would have been the center of attention. One of the things that's interesting about this picture is you have 11 of the disciples around Jesus, and then you have this figure there, which I'm assuming is Judas, who's on his way out, because sometime during this Last Supper, he left, because he was going to go bring the officials to help them arrest Jesus privately. So I think that's what's happening there. But actually, in what we're going to look at in the story today, Judas was there. The actual details we're focusing on today, Judas is not walking out the door. Okay, he's got a place at the table. Judas had a place at that table. Judas had a place at that table. So Luke 22 starts off with Luke telling us about kind of the plot to get rid of Jesus. The Passover is coming, so lots of people have come to Jerusalem for the festival. There's big crowds. There's probably more Roman soldiers there. It's probably a good time for pickpockets and all sorts of crimes to happen. But people are gathered, and the leaders, religious leaders, some of the elders of the people are trying to get rid of Jesus. We've already seen that they're afraid of the people, so they don't quite know how to do that. But then we're told that Satan enters Judas, who's one of the 12. So we know that Jesus' enemies are not just human enemies. He's got these cosmic, supernatural enemies who are opposed to his agenda. And so we don't know Judas's motives, other than, he's somehow under the influence of Satan at this point. But he goes to the leaders because he knows kind of Jesus' schedule, where he's going to be, and he knows when Jesus might be separated from the crowds. And so he, agrees for some money to, deliver Jesus to them. So that's how Luke 22 starts. But then it says, when the day of unleavened bread came, which is the Passover, when the Passover lamb was sacrificed, Jesus made arrangement, and he sends Peter and John into the city, and he tells them how they can meet someone who's going to lead them to an upper room, and it's going to be ready for a group of people to celebrate this Passover meal, and Peter and John are going to make the final arrangements for Jesus and the other disciples to arrive, and they're going to celebrate this Passover, 24 hours before Jesus is going to be crucified. Then it says this, when the hour came. That first phrase, the hour came, indicates that this is an intentional time, a known time, that Jesus is on an agenda, and he's got a timetable, and he's following that timetable, and he's walking through the steps. And we saw this weeks ago from Luke chapter 9. Already Jesus was walking steps to Jerusalem. And everything that he did and everywhere he went, it was always with Jerusalem in his mind, which means the crucifixion was always in his mind. He was always headed for that event, and he was headed to that hour, and he knows about this hour, this significant hour. And so when it came, Jesus and his apostles are reclining at the table. And he says to them, eagerly have I desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. In those few words, there's a lot of meaning that is packed in there. We know that suffering is coming. Okay? And Jesus knows the suffering is coming, so everything that's happening is in light of the suffering that is coming. It's Jesus' suffering, and I don't know if in the next few weeks, we'll give a description of the crucifixion. It's worth your while to read about what a Roman crucifixion was like. It was like the worst possible death, and that's the suffering that is coming up, and Jesus knows it. So he's already announcing suffering, and we'll come back to how the disciples don't quite get that. They don't really hear the word suffering. It doesn't sink into their hearts, and it's going to lead them to say some fairly stupid things. But we also find out something about the kind of suffering, because it's associated with this Passover festival. And if you were with us a while ago for our Exodus series, we talked about the Passover and one of the most important festivals and what it symbolized. And if you remember the story from the book of Exodus, when people were delivered from Egypt, they would kill the animal, and the angel was coming to destroy the firstborn, and so people would put the blood, on the top and sides of the doors, and when the blood was there, that was an indication that this is a family, people here who are protected by the blood, by the covenant, and so the angel would pass over them, and it was on that night that God delivered his people. So the Passover and the suffering is all about how God is delivering his people. Jesus isn't just dying because the Romans are bad or because the Jewish leaders are bad. He's dying because he wants to deliver people. He's part of the Father's plan to save people. This death is not just another death. It's not just heroic death. It's a death to save. Another interesting thing about this is where Jesus says, "Eagerly have I desired to eat this." Literally, it's with desire I have desired this. And so we see, again, like we saw last week, a little bit of emotion on the part of Jesus, an emotional investment in what's going on. Again, it's not just, here's another meal. We've had a Passover meal in the past, and if Jesus is 33 years old, he's maybe had a number of these Passover. It's not another Passover meal. This is special. And Jesus has been eagerly looking forward to this moment at this table with these men. Eagerly, he's been looking forward to it. It's meaningful to him. What's going on here? It's not just another meal. It's not just another Passover meal. It's now full of meaning. And Luke is going to try to unpack some of this meaning that Jesus is pouring in to this event. But it's important to Jesus. Again, he's invested in it emotionally. He's not just going through the motions. It's not a ritual. One of the reasons I don't really like the word ritual is because we can, and I can do things as a ritual, and I just kind of go through the motions without being emotionally invested in it. But Jesus isn't like that. He's eager to be with these guys, eager to share this meal with them, to break the bread and give it to them, and to pass the wine to them. Another thing that's kind of hinted here when Jesus talks about not eating it until it finds its fulfillment in the kingdom of God is there's this idea of waiting. We can anticipate a period of waiting. After this event, before this happens again for Jesus, there's this period of time. We won't talk about that now. Some of the sermons that are coming up, we're going to talk about what about this time of waiting, because we're in this in-between time. Jesus is still waiting, actually. After this event, he says, I'm not going to experience this again. Jesus is kind of saying, okay, I'm giving up something for Lent, you might say. I'm going to give up something. From now until, once again, we're all going to be seated at this table. He's going to put himself into this period of waiting, anticipating that day that is coming. And we're still in this waiting time. But Jesus is looking forward to that moment. He too is waiting. And again, it's one of those things where it's hard to figure out what does that mean? He's Jesus. He's the Son of God. How can Jesus wait? What does it mean for Jesus to wait? And I can't sort all that out, how God being a human, I don't know how to put all the pieces together. But Jesus is waiting, and he's looking forward to that day. You might say there's a sense in which he is now missing something, waiting for the day when once again he's going to share this place at a table with his people. So there's a lot of meaning in just those couple verses. And then we come to actually this time when Jesus breaks the bread and so forth. And so he says, after taking a cup, he gives thanks and says, "Take this and divide it among you. And in a Passover meal, there'd be 4 times you pass the cup around. So this time is probably the first or the second time where Jesus is passing the cup of wine around. But he says, "Take it, divide it among yourselves. For I tell you, I will not drink it again. I won't drink again of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And then he takes the bread, and he gave thanks and broke it, and he gives it to them. They might be remembering that time, some months before when he broke the bread and multiplied the bread. Now it's physical bread, but it's symbolizing spiritual bread, and just like he poured out plenty of physical bread, he's pouring out plenty of spiritual life for anyone who wants to take it. So he broke the bread, gave it to them, and said, "This is my body. It's given for you." Once again, the suffering is for others, for the sake of others. "Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, and this is probably the third of the 4 cups of wine, because in the tradition, this is kind of the cup of redemption. So he takes this cup, and he says, "This cup is a new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." It's a covenant, it's a promise, and that's an important word for them. They know it's about God's eternal plan to bless his people, how God committed himself to the good of his people, and Jesus is shedding his blood and giving his blood, pouring out his blood, so that God's covenant, God's promises would be fulfilled. Now, Luke does something interesting here that I think is his way of helping us to look at this event in the right way. And the sign of that is he tells this story a little bit differently than Matthew and Mark tell this story. When Matthew and Mark tell this story, this line in verse 17 or verse 18, where Jesus says, "I will not drink it again, the fruit of the vine, until the kingdom of God comes." When Matthew and Mark tell the story, they put that sentence at the end of the event. Okay, after Jesus does all of this, then Jesus says that. When Luke tells the story, he puts this saying at the beginning, this saying about the kingdom of God. But then at the end of this event, and we'll get to that, Luke includes some other things that Jesus talks about the kingdom of God. So what Luke does here is he frames this event, this Lord's Supper, with the kingdom of God, beginning and the end, and it's Luke's way of trying to say that this event is about the kingdom of God, and we need to be thinking about the kingdom of God and what the kingdom of God is. And one of the reasons I say this, and this might come up in a few weeks if we're able to have the Lord's Supper together, is when we think about the death of Jesus, and this is supposed to remind us about the death of Jesus. And often when churches celebrate the Lord's Supper, it doesn't seem like a celebration. Okay, because often we're, encouraged to be very introspective, maybe encouraged to be sad, or even think about, oh, look how terrible the death of Jesus was, and we should be sad about that. Or maybe we should be sad about our sin. And in a sense, that's true. I mean, we should be sad about our sin, and we should, think soberly about the death of Jesus. But that's not the way Luke wants us to think. He wants us to think about this. This is about the kingdom. And it should be a celebration. It's about a party. And when we think about the Lord's Supper, the focus is not on the price that Jesus paid to provide it, though that's important, but it's about what Jesus provides, what he wants to give. It's about the table that Jesus is spreading for us and sitting down at and inviting us to. It is about joy. It should be a joyful time. We should experience it as joy. When we think about what Jesus has done for us, it should create joy more than sadness. And that's what I think Luke wants us to focus on when we think about the Lord's Supper. It's about the kingdom. It's about the blessing that God wants to pour out. All the way back to Genesis 1 and 2. It's what God wanted to pour out on all creation, and now it's actually possible through the work of Jesus, and the kingdom is possible. I want us to think about that phrase, kingdom, and we're going to think about what the kingdom is, and I want us to think about this phrase, kingdom culture, and that phrase is used in a lot of different ways, but we need to think about what the kingdom is, what it's supposed to look like, and what does that mean for us. If we are part of the kingdom, if we see ourselves as part of the kingdom of God, then what does it mean for us? If we are invited to this table, what does this table look like? And how are we supposed to sit at this table? How are we supposed to act at this table? And who else is at the table? And there's a culture that Luke, in fact, I should say actually Jesus, is trying to produce here. And everything that he's doing with his disciples, he's trying to produce a culture among these people so that they're always acting in a certain way. I mean, that's how culture works. You don't think about living out your culture. You just live out your culture because it's your culture. And that's why we see differences among us, because, we live out our culture. It's automatic. That's the nature of culture. Okay, and there's a kingdom culture that isn't going to be automatic for us, but we need to train ourselves so that it does become automatic and we just behave in a certain way around this table. And so what we have here is after the establishment of the Lord's Supper, some details that tell us a little bit about who is at the table and how they arrange themselves. So back to Luke 22. Literally right after Jesus says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Then he says, "But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man will go, as it has been decreed. But woe to the man who betrays him. The hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table." Judas is at the table. At this point, Judas is at the table. And when Jesus breaks the bread, it's handed to Judas. Jesus already knows what Judas is going to do, obviously. He's just said he knows it's going to happen. Judas thought it was private, but nothing is private to Jesus. But he's at the table, Judas is. And Jesus hands him bread. "This is my body, here, Judas. This is my blood, here, Judas." So it's significant who is at the table. And one of those at the table is Judas at this point. Pretty soon he's going to go, but he's at the table at this point. There's an interesting reaction among the disciples, though, and it's one of those times when you kind of think, what idiots are these guys? In fact, that's, in a sense, we ought to say this several times in the next few little things that happen with Jesus and disciples. How stupid can these guys be? How dense? Well, Jesus says, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed by someone here. And so it says they began to question among themselves which of them it might be. So they're not quite sure. They don't know that it's Judas. From the other Gospels, some were like, "Is it me? Am I the one who's going to do it? Am I the bad guy at the table?" So they're thinking that kind of thing. The fact that some of them would think, "Is it me?" shows, I don't know what it shows. I mean, maybe it shows some humility. They realize that they're weak. But they have this little discussion about who's it's going to be. But the sad news isn't that they have that discussion among themselves, who's going to betray him. It's that they lose that train of thought very quickly and go on to another discussion. It says, "Also a dispute arose among them as to which was be considered the greatest." I mean, how easily distracted these guys are. I mean, Jesus has said someone is going to betray him, and they're trying to figure out, is it me, is it me, is it you? That really ought to consume them, I guess, but somehow or another, they move on to a much more foolish discussion, who's going to be greatest? Okay, if I'm not the one who's going to betray Jesus, maybe I'm actually the greatest. But it's really more like, we can't figure out who's going to betray Jesus. Let's forget about that. Let's figure out who's the greatest. I mean, of all the stupid conversations to possibly have, who's going to be greatest? I mean, it's bad enough that we have that thought, and we probably all had that thought of where do we rank in terms of other people. I've said before, I remember when Justin was like in 4th grade, he was telling us, his ranking in his class, who was most popular, and he had determined he was like the 4th most popular in his class. I don't know how he sorted that out, but we have that thought, but how stupid to have this discussion, this public discussion in front of Jesus. But they do. So Jesus says, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them. He's kind of saying, guys, who do you think you're speaking like? What culture are you speaking out of? Your interest is a Gentile interest. It's part of Gentile culture. It's not our culture. The kings of Gentiles, they lord it over people, and those who exercise authority like to call themselves benefactors. And they would use that word because they would do things for people, give loans or help people out. They would be benefactors for their cities. They would build official buildings and so forth. But they would do these things as benefactors because in the culture then, it always meant people were obligated to do something back. If I give this much money, if I build you this building, then you have to honor me. So they would do these good things, not because they wanted to intrinsically do good things, but because they wanted to exalt themselves. And the more you had to give, the greater power that you had, because you could put more people in your obligation. Yeah. And Jesus is saying that's how the culture out there works. People want to puff themselves up, make themselves important. In some Roman towns, people would give money for a pavement stone, but they would carve their name on it. So everyone walking there was, oh, look at this great guy. He paid for this pavement stone. It was really a way to, exalt themselves through their power and through their money. But Jesus says that's the way culture works out there, but not for you. You're not to be like that. The greatest among you should be like the youngest. The one who rules like the one who serves. Now, of course, now people talk about, servant leadership, and sometimes servant leadership is still just another way to manipulate people. I'm going to serve you, but really I just want to manipulate you into doing what I want. And it's not really serving people for the sake of others. It's acting like we're serving, because it's a better business model to pretend that you're serving. If you act like you're serving, people will like you and you'll sell more and that kind of thing. But again, it's still a way of building ourselves up. Jesus is not talking about that kind of servant leadership. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Isn't it the one who is at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves. So Jesus is talking about who is important at the table. And how do we rate ourselves? And are we concerned not just about being at the table, but we're also concerned of what kind of seat do we have? Do we have an important seat at the table? And how important are we at the table? What does it mean to be important at this table? Is everyone equally important, or is some people more important than others? And what Jesus is saying, who is important at the table, truly important, is the one who serves. He's overturning how culture is supposed to work. Then there's a third point that Jesus makes about this kingdom culture that's related to the temple, and it's about how acceptable these people are at the table. Okay, they've got a place at the table, and even Judas has a place at the table. This is another just amazing piece of this story, and it ought to blow us away, the back and forth dialogue that is happening here, because first there's, Judas is going to betray him, and then these disciples are having this so stupid discussion. And Jesus basically rebukes them for that. You're not supposed to be like that, guys. Okay, come on, what are you thinking? But then suddenly, it's like a complete turn. Jesus then says, "You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom." These 11 or 12 stupid guys who have just behaved badly, Jesus says, by the way, I'm giving you a kingdom. Whatever stupid conversation you just had, I'm still giving you a kingdom. I confer on you a kingdom just as my Father conferred one on you, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Are you kidding me? These guys, Jesus sees past who they look like right at that moment, and they have not been such impressive men through most of the Gospel of Luke. They've not been that impressive. Jesus says, but I give you a kingdom. Not only that, I give you a position of significance in the kingdom. And this image of the 12 tribes and ruling on thrones and judging. That's how acceptable they are at this table. In spite of how stupid they are, they're not just allowed to sit at the table in the corner or under the table, but they're given a place of honor at the table, a place of significance, a place of meaning at the table. These guys, there's a phrase, I've been using the phrase a place at the table, but people use the phrase a seat at the table, and if you do a Google search of images, it's especially, talking about people who've been excluded from the table. It's especially used, for instance, how women have been denied a seat at the table in a lot of venues, which is true, in the business world and so forth. Generally, in a lot of our worlds, it's a male-dominated society, and women have not been allowed a seat at the table, or minorities have not been allowed a seat at the table, or different kinds of people have not been allowed a seat at the table. And so people ask the question, who has a seat at the table? And isn't it good that, let's say, women have a seat at the table? I think it is good, by the way. I'm fairly positive about women in leadership and women in significant roles. I tend more toward women can do lots of things rather than we should limit women or whatever. But that's an important question. Who has a seat at the table, not just to be there, but who has a voice, who has some authority, who has some influence at the table? How truly acceptable are they at the table? Do they really have a seat, or just a seat but they got to shut up? Do they have a voice at the table? And these guys are so accepted at the table that they're going to have a voice. And even though in a sense Jesus is highlighting these particular men, as we're going to see when we get into the book of Acts, that these guys represent the rest of the church. And earlier in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus has said to a larger crowd, not just these guys, "Don't be afraid, little flock. For the Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom." The Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom. That's how acceptable they are at the table. These guys. Not just to have a seat in the corner, but an equal seat in a place of significance, a place of contribution. They get to be a part. That's how accepted they are at this table. But then once again, one final incident, we come back to highlighting who is at this table. Well, Jesus says to these guys, "I confer on you a kingdom." But then he looks at Peter and he says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, but I prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. When you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. He replies, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. I'm sure he means it at that moment. I'm sure in his heart he thinks that's sincere. He probably thinks, yeah, I can do that. I'm the kind of guy who could go to death with Jesus. I think he means that sincerely because he doesn't really know his heart. Jesus says, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And of course, he does. He denies that he even knows Jesus. Jesus is arrested and is there in the distance. Peter can see, and Jesus is going to be able to see Peter, and Peter is going to 3 times, and he's going to swear, no, I don't know the guy. Jesus knows Peter's heart. He knows what he's going to do. He's going to deny knowing Jesus. That makes it all the more significant what Jesus just said to Peter. I give you a kingdom, and you're going to get to judge. Oh, you're going to screw up big time. I give you a kingdom. So Judas is at the table, and Peter is at the table, even though Jesus knows everything that's in Peter's heart. Every sin that Peter could possibly commit, Jesus already knows. Do we get that? He already knows. He's never surprised. Jesus is never surprised by our weakness and stupidity. He knows it better than we do. I don't know what kind of screw-ups I'm going to do this week, but I'm sure I'm going to. Jesus already knows that. If you knew how I'm going to screw up this week, you would not be listening to me right now. Seriously. You would be out this door and you'd be thinking, how in the world, can we be listening to Mark? Mark shouldn't have this job. But Jesus knows, and he still has a place at the table. It's interesting when Jesus first addresses him here, he says, Simon, Simon. That's how Peter's friends knew him back when they were fishing, and when we first meet him, he's Simon. When Jesus first gets in his boat in Luke chapter 5. But then as he's called to be, one of the 12, he's given the name Peter, and through most of the Gospel of Luke, he's Peter. Suddenly now, once again, Jesus is saying Simon. And I don't know, but it might be that what Jesus is trying to get Peter to think through is, who is he going to be? Is he going to be Simon like he was? Because he's about to be Simon. In the next couple hours, he's going to be Simon. But if he'll turn, he can be Peter again, but he's got to choose what he's going to do, what he's going to be, who he's going to be. He still has to make this choice. Jesus is offering a place at the table, but he's got to choose. Is it going to be Simon? Is it going to be who he was? Or is it going to be who Jesus wants him to be and is making him to be? So this is kingdom culture, and I've said before, and we've talked about culture being counterculture, alter culture, and where does kingdom culture most differ from other cultures? And it's not mainly about what kind of clothes we wear, what our hair is like. In my world, when I grew up, man having a long hair, that's a big sin. Women wearing pants, I think every single woman in this room is in sin. If you were in my world when I was a kid, that's how our culture was. Women wear dresses, men have short hair, they don't have beards. Women don't wear too much makeup, and there's all sorts of things that people have thought of that this is how Christians should differ. But none of those things, even if they're in the Bible, are emphasized in the Bible. Where our culture needs to most radically differ is about how we see and treat people, about the table, about who gets a place at our table, and how acceptable they are at our table, who is invited, and who we exclude, if we exclude, or if we are, or how are we supposed to do it, or are we supposed to exclude people. But it's by our relationship with people, symbolized by the table. That's how our culture needs to differ. That's what people need to see. And this is just, repeated. I mean, most clearly, in the song that's based on Scripture, they'll know we are Christians by our, the last word. They'll know we are Christians by our love. They'll know we are Christians by our love. Okay? That's the culture. We ought to be known as that kind of culture. How are you Christians different? Well, man, those guys let anyone come. Anyone can sit at the table. It's not that everything that these guys are doing is okay. Jesus rebukes them. And Judas turns his back on Jesus, and I don't know that there was any eternal hope for Judas. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the table was offered. Jesus' life was offered for Judas. And it was offered for Peter. It was offered for all of us, even as we are. And I imagine, if you were honest, you could probably say the same thing I said a moment ago. Man, if people knew what was in my heart and what I struggle with and my weaknesses and temptations, they wouldn't want me here on Sunday. And we're all probably grateful this morning. We ought to be grateful, that no one really knows our hearts. It's kind of good news. But the really good news is the one who knows our hearts invites us to the table. That's Jesus. That's Jesus. Lord, thank you for this good news. Thank you for the kind of table, the feast that you have wanted to offer to your people. Thank you that that's so important to you, that you yourself are waiting for that day in the future when again, literally, physically, we will share that table with you. Thank you for that offer. Lord, may we choose to be not who we were, but who you want us to be. May we choose to be what you see us to be, what you see that we can be, and may we pursue that path. Thank you for this good news this morning. Amen.